Congresswoman Omar recently confronted America's second-in-command with accusations of denying opportunities to incoming asylum seekers, directing her attacks at an individual raised in a home where the only escape route was out of a drug den, yet who still ascended upward step by grueling step, relying on sheer determination without any financial safety net. She labeled him completely two-faced. He responded by sharing his most recent moment of sincere gratitude. On May 22, 2025, the American Senate hosted an extraordinary gathering focused on border policy, creating the rare spectacle of representatives speaking directly to senators, an uncommon but legally sanctioned procedure for issues demanding input from both legislative chambers. Second-in-command JD Vance oversaw the proceedings from his designated seat, mirroring the historical tradition of his predecessors by remaining quiet, fulfilling his mandated attendance duties without the expectation of contributing verbally. Ilhan Omar, the congressional delegate representing Minnesota's 5th District, received an invitation to articulate the liberal faction's stance. She approached the microphone with her hijab impeccably styled, her speech echoing across the room's wooden walls, yet rather than discussing border legislation, she pivoted to confront the leader seated at the main dais. She locked her eyes straight onto JD Vance and prepared to strike. Hit the thumbs-up icon as you are preparing to witness America's second-highest executive reply to an aggressive charge using an inquiry so profoundly basic and relatable that his fierce challenger remained completely speechless and totally dumbfounded for an agonizingly long 10-second span. Vice President Vance, Omar pronounced his title with the harsh tone of a district attorney addressing a guilty suspect, monotone, heavy, and implicitly condemned. The legislative room grew tense. Lawmakers previously distracted by their screens raised their heads. Staffers engaged in quiet chatter instantly quieted down. Knowing the rules for a representative speaking in this hall are strict, you speak to the collective assembly rather than the individual presiding, utilizing formal titles like Mr. or Madam President instead of directly naming the person in charge, and you certainly never use such a hostile vocal inflection. Vice President Vance, you perfectly embody the act of denying others basic opportunities. Omar's delivery possessed the rehearsed tempo common to countless congressional monologues, carefully paced and strategically formatted to generate impactful sound bites for the primetime television broadcasts. You successfully fled destitution, bravo, yet your immediate follow-up was shutting out all incoming asylum seekers, arriving migrants, and desperate individuals attempting to replicate your exact path. She grasped the lectern tightly with two hands, not out of anxiety, since Omar never felt stage fright. She squeezed to highlight the tension in her hands, as prominent knuckles projected an image of fierce determination, and projecting determination always looked fantastic on the numerous broadcast lenses focused directly upon her. You authored a memoir regarding the nation's promise, a massive hit that granted you celebrity status and immense wealth before securing public office to deliberately obstruct others from achieving identical success. You remain a well-dressed fraud, sir, an individual who reaped the rewards of this nation's social programs only to actively legislate for their complete and total elimination. She stopped speaking. The expansive room settled into the specific quietness of 100 officials, recognizing an unspoken boundary was nearing its breaking point with absolutely no way to halt the collision. And let us speak truthfully regarding your true nature. Omar tilted her face upwards, the same posture that had confronted conservative media hosts, legislative disciplinary measures, and physical endangerment, keeping her head resolutely held high. You never succeeded through pure independent grit. You wed into Ivy League connections, accepted billionaire funding, and represent a commander who insulted your demographic until their electoral support became necessary. She allowed the insult to linger. You are no hero for blue-collar laborers. You act as a mere political instrument leveraging a tragic childhood. The gathered crowd released a breath, not in shock, but producing the collective noise of an audience hearing a predictable, harsh reality spoken out loud when they assumed it would remain unspoken. From the elevated platform, JD Vance remained completely motionless, lacking the paralysis of a shocked victim or the calculated freezing of a debating politician. instead showing the composure of an Ohio native who had endured harsher insults from his mom during her darkest episodes, specifically times when the narcotics dwindled and her temper flared, teaching a young teenager that the noisiest individual present rarely wields the actual power. He avoided squirming in his seat, ignored his necktie, and abstained from grabbing a drink. He simply stared at Omar, displaying a look perfectly captured by the broadcasting lenses, conveying neither rage nor humor nor disdain, but pure familiarity, reflecting the silent acknowledgement of someone familiar with this exact routine, the resentment tactic, the accusation of selling out, the narrative insisting that genuine hardship requires a lifetime of continuous financial failure. He delayed speaking until her conclusion. He paused an additional 3 beats afterward, skipping theatricality, fully understanding that hurried comebacks signal a lack of verbal confidence, whereas he relied on his vocabulary with the same absolute certainty he placed in his former military instructors. Afterwards, the nation's second-in-command tilted his body closer to the broadcasting device. Congresswoman Omar, his tone remained soft, featuring a Midwestern calmness that refuses to shout over the commotion yet effortlessly pierces through the din. Much like a knife requires no volume to slice effectively, I extend my gratitude for your intense fervor. He stopped momentarily. I want to share a narrative with you, or rather I will share our 2 separate narratives, because comparing them directly against one another yields a deeply fascinating outcome. I was raised in Middletown, Ohio, he stated, pronouncing the city's title exactly as one speaks of a birthplace that serves as their foundational identity, letting the sounds roll out smoothly after decades of bearing its weight. Its residency hovered around 48,000 and dropping, formerly a manufacturing hub, yet during my youth it transformed into a narcotics haven. He cast his gaze across the legislative floor, ignoring Omar to observe the assembly of lawmakers, their assistants, and the crowded observation decks. My mom suffered from severe addiction, avoiding the clinical terminology politicians favor like substance dependency or epidemic figures on a graph. She suffered in a manner requiring an adolescent to return from class, discover her unconscious near the toilet, and choose between contacting emergency services or managing the crisis alone, knowing previous ambulance calls resulted in a fortnight of angry silence. Absolute quiet. The expansive legislative room, previously vibrating from her aggressive remarks, grew entirely dead. I resided in, and I will speak candidly since my published memoir made these facts public knowledge, a residence containing more pharmaceutical containers than edible meals, where power companies severed our connection repeatedly within months, and where my mother entertained countless destructive romantic partners, each bringing a unique brand of absolute catastrophe to our doorstep. His palms lay flat against the wooden surface, unclenched and relaxed, representing someone completely reconciled with his difficult past, resembling the acceptance of an old physical wound, avoiding any attempts to conceal it while simultaneously refusing to flaunt it, simply allowing it to naturally exist. Eventually, my grandmother, Mama, brought me into her home. She was an elderly chain smoker hiding a loaded firearm beneath her bed springs, and she actively rescued my entire existence. She bypassed social interventions and federal welfare payments, rescuing me instead by repeating daily that I possessed true worth, commanding me never to let another person label me as garbage. He hesitated, dropped his gaze to his fingers briefly, and raised his eyes again. The United States provided that, provided my grandmother, and provided a local military enlistment center where a commanding officer evaluated a scrawny teenager escaping a drug den and deemed him worthy. It offered me veteran educational benefits, access to a state university, and entry into an elite law program where indeed, Congresswoman, I encountered my spouse before ultimately granting me this very position. He observed her without aggression, maintaining a serene, borderline tender demeanor. Now allow me to recount your history, since it remains a remarkably compelling tale as well. He tilted slightly onward. You entered this world in Somalia during the early 80s. Societal collapse erupted during your childhood, forcing your relatives to escape, not just casually move, but desperately run. executing the type of frantic retreat where families grab only essentials, refusing to glance backward to spare their offspring from witnessing horrific atrocities. He detailed her background with an exactness that caught the room off guard, avoiding hostility in favor of factual recitation, offering her biography the identical gravity he applied to his personal timeline. You endured 4 agonizing years inside a Kenyan displaced persons camp, Dadaab, unless my memory fails. I have studied Dadaab, housing massive populations lacking basic plumbing across numerous zones, providing merely a single physician for tens of thousands of inhabitants. You were simply a minor lacking any agency in that nightmare, since adolescents never ask for displacement camps, exactly as adolescents never request to inhabit drug dens. The parallel registered softly yet held massive weight. A pair of youths, double the trauma, sharing one ultimate national destination. In the mid-90s, the American Republic, this specific nation, the identical government you recently claimed I abandoned, welcomed your relatives as officially recognized asylum seekers. Among all the nations across the globe your kin might have approached, ours agreed to host you, relocating you first to the East Coast and subsequently the Midwest, providing legal naturalization, offering the exact state-funded education system you currently disparage, granting you electoral participation, and securing your right to seek political positions, which you successfully captured multiple times. You transitioned directly from a desperate African tent city straight into the federal legislature. He allowed the reality to permeate the room, letting the trajectory from a survival camp to a congressional seat linger in the air, mirroring how his personal journey from a narcotic-infested home to the executive branch had resonated mere minutes prior. 2 distinct trajectories featuring identical contours drafted by the same homeland. Congresswoman, this nation handed us the entire world, not a flawless reality, nor an effortless one, but the type of existence accompanied by severe friction, massive setbacks, and mornings spent questioning the value of continuing, yet it was undeniably everything. The debate never centers on what the country provided us, rather it revolves around our subsequent contributions in return. She parted her lips to initiate a retort, syllables preparing to launch, yet he retained control of the floor, a fact the room clearly understood since his volume remained steady, knowing that increasing volume indicates someone searching for an argument, while a consistently flat tone belongs to an orator fully equipped with their thesis and casually marching it forward. During the September 2001 terrorist attacks, he stated, I remained a 17-year-old secondary student finishing my final local academic term. He scanned the grand hall, though momentarily his vision drifted beyond those walls, focusing on a distant memory over 2 decades old that continued to smolder brightly. I recall my exact location, sitting in a morning literature session when an individual rushed inside announcing an aircraft had struck the massive New York towers. We migrated toward the dining hall containing a television set, witnessing the subsequent collision happen in real time. As a teenager, I lacked any precedent for such destruction, exactly like my peers. His vocal delivery maintained its calmness, avoiding theatricality or shaking, presenting a recollection as perfectly detailed as a physical snapshot. The following morning, on the 12th, a quartet of my schoolmates visited the Armed Forces Enlistment Center located right on our Central Avenue, 4 boys total. Immediately following the tragedy, they ignored any impending military deployments, skipped watching the Commander-in-Chief deliver his national address, and simply strolled inside the very next day demanding the enlistment paperwork. A single member of that group, whose identity I will protect, failed to return completely intact. He survives locally, managing warehouse logistics, yet he permanently abandoned a portion of his soul in Iraq that remains unrecoverable. He stared straight at his opponent. That represents my hometown's reaction to the tragedy. We eagerly signed up. He permitted his statement to linger uninterrupted for 3 slow beats. Congresswoman, during a charity gala a few years ago, you summarized that dark day using these exact terms. That day, he completely bypassed checking his notes, finding it unnecessary, since the entire audience recognized her infamous phrase, Certain individuals committed certain actions. The upper seating area rustled, producing an auditory reaction trapped halfway between a sharp inhale and a low whisper, rippling across the space, resembling wind sweeping through tall weeds. Thousands of our citizens perished. Brave first responders who charged up stairwells fully aware they lacked an exit strategy, corporate employees phoning home from skyscraper windows to bid eternal farewells, brave civilian travelers actively overtaking a hijacked aircraft cabin. My closest childhood companions, the athletes I tackled on the field, entered the brutal military infantry strictly due to those events. His facial muscles clenched, marking the singular bodily reaction he had revealed, a stiffening near his cheekbone, representing a subtle clench that a person who acquired psychological restraint inside a drug environment and finalized it during military training only displays when the internal fury is absolutely authentic. Yet your characterization labeled it a mere action. He paused, allowing the terminology to settle into the wood-lined room, mirroring a heavy pebble sinking beneath undisturbed ponds. Certain individuals doing certain actions. They were never anonymous actors, ma'am. They operated as extreme militant extremists massacring thousands of our civilians, and it hardly constituted a minor action. It represented the deadliest foreign strike upon our mainland since the Second World War. My inner circle volunteered for deadly combat purely because of those horrific hours. Several actually perished, and you minimized their catalyst to a vague occurrence. Her face remained elevated and her spinal alignment looked flawless, yet her gaze, marking a first since assuming control of the microphone, shifted downward slightly rather than retreating from him entirely, pivoting only a minor increment, reminiscent of a navigational dial trembling as a magnetic force skirts past, failing to totally redirect her aim but confirming the instrument absorbed the undeniable pull. "Allow me to speak truthfully regarding a specific matter," he remarked, utilizing a phrase that operated as his personal trademark, acting less like a conversational filler and more like an official hazard sign within his rhetorical arsenal. Stating his desire for honesty signaled the metaphorical disengaging of his weapons safety lock. Following the publication of my autobiography, I absorbed immense backlash, and remarkably, the loudest detractors hailed from my personal background, residents of my hometown and the broader mountain region. They accused me of exposing private shame, ruining our collective reputation, and broadcasting to the globe that my mom struggled with narcotics, my household lacked stability, and our local economy faced imminent collapse. He gave a slow bob of his head. Furthermore, their assessments were accurate. I exposed those realities precisely because they represented facts, and I maintained, as I continue maintaining today, that the solitary method for resolving any crisis involves brutal transparency, avoiding suppression, refusing to scapegoat the watchdogs, and openly declaring that a system failed, detailing its exact mechanics and quantifying the brutal toll it demands. He shifted his attention back toward his opponent. "Congresswoman, your specific demographic, the immigrant enclave located in Minnesota, harbored a massive scandal as well." He maintained a steady volume, avoided leaning aggressively, and retained his exact seating position, displaying the body language of someone lacking the urge to close the physical gap since the undeniable evidence was currently marching directly toward the opposition. Regarding the National Childhood Meals Initiative, throughout a recent 2-year span, hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially reaching several billion based upon differing governmental audits, were criminally extracted, actively looted from an infrastructure intended to nourish hungry minors. Dozens of individuals faced indictments during the most extensive viral-era swindle in our national record. He allowed the statistics to sink in before supplying additional details. "Permit me to illustrate the practical reality of massive looted welfare funds at their final destination. It resembles a local avenue distribution center claiming thousands of daily plates distributed, yet when auditors arrived to verify, absolutely no youths were on the premises, lacking a single adolescent while invoicing for endless portions without filling a single stomach. Those stolen finances purchased exotic vehicles, international land parcels abroad, and multi-million-dollar housing collections for a specific conspirator, acquiring premium apartments using the very currency designated to supply midday snacks for elementary school students. He halted, leaving the legislative chamber encased in total silence. Moreover, these culprits were hardly unknown entities operating outside your jurisdiction, ma'am. They functioned directly inside your electoral boundaries, managed by your voters, while your own residents flagged the corruption, and upon the arrival of investigative agencies seeking to uncover why empty cafeterias invoiced for massive banquets, you publicly stated your position. He locked eyes with her, and she returned his stare with an unmoving expression, holding the steady nerve of a politician accustomed to surviving legislative reprimands, although her dominant palm released the lectern to fall vertically, acting less as a surrender and more as a stabilization tactic, resembling the bodily corrections someone instinctively performs when the earth shakes underneath their footwear. And how did you react, Congresswoman, when the authorities arrived in your city to determine how massive sums dedicated to starving kids vanished as federal agents initiated their probes? You labeled their inquiry completely disorganized, utilizing the exact term chaotic. You refused to brand the theft as chaotic, applying the label exclusively to the detectives, arguing that federal authorities were unfairly prosecuting neighborhood charities, the very same charities invoicing taxpayers for entirely fictitious youth. He slowly swiveled his face side to side, avoiding theatricality, projecting the mild confusion of a person struggling to comprehend an illogical equation. Whenever my neighbors faced crises, genuine disasters, horrific situations you actively hide from journalists, I documented them with pure candor. This decision ruined my personal relationships, destroyed my holiday gatherings, and created hometown enemies who continually refused to acknowledge my presence. Yet I spoke honestly, since the individuals enduring those hardships, the adolescents in drug dens, the households burying patriarchs due to overdoses, naturally warranted an honest accounting far more than I required personal ease. He paused once more. Yet when your demographic confronted a similar scale of disaster, specifically grifters robbing minors, you ran interference, aggressively criticized the authorities attempting to halt the crimes, and left the targeted youths lacking their promised nourishment completely famished. She transferred her bodily balance across her legs, executing the subtle movement of a seasoned arguer adjusting her footing, avoiding a total withdrawal while acknowledging that her rhetorical foundation possessed a newly altered texture. Her assistant, a sharply dressed junior staffer seated shortly behind the lectern, began scribbling fiercely across a legal pad, not drafting arguments for her benefit, but rather documenting details for his personal preservation, as Capitol staffers typically produce two distinct variations of memoranda. Documents designed to elevate their superiors and documents generated to salvage their personal employment prospects, with this activity clearly representing the latter category. Congresswoman, allow me to speak truthfully regarding another issue, and there the warning appeared once more, the figurative weapon unholstered, prompting the massive legislative hall, having rapidly memorized this aggressive sequence, to brace for impact. I accumulated my wealth by publishing a memoir. I drafted the manuscript, a printing company purchased the rights, the public consumed the pages, and while opinions varied wildly, the financial exchange remained entirely straightforward, an honest trade of literature for cash, fully visible through my openly available IRS filings. He halted momentarily before continuing. Following the publication, I joined the private equity sector, funding various startups with mixed success rates, yet my compensation remained verifiable, my portfolios were legally declared, and upon launching my legislative campaign, I submitted every single economic document mandated by federal statutes, lacking zero exceptions. He locked eyes with her and proposed, "Let us discuss your finances, Congresswoman." Her jawline angled upward by the tiniest margin, a nearly imperceptible motion serving as her distinct poker tell, since elevating her face universally signaled the deployment of her psychological defensive plating. Your electoral operation, your legally registered political committee, transferred nearly $4 million directly to a specific advisory agency, and the primary creator and chief executive operating that exact agency happens to be Tim Minette. He stopped to note, and that executive serves as your spouse, causing zero shock within the viewing balcony since the Capitol's insiders possessed prior knowledge, yet experiencing the facts neatly organized within the hallowed chamber via his emotionless heartland tone felt remarkably distinct from skimming a digital newsletter, given that journalism feels theoretical, whereas a live vocal accusation feels tangibly real. Millions in donor cash funneled straight into your partner's enterprise triggered a regulatory grievance, forcing your team to retroactively alter their paperwork, and these corrected documents highlighted massive expenditures completely omitted from the initial disclosures, guaranteeing that the first drafts were fundamentally inaccurate or deliberately partial. Regardless of the specific reasoning, ma'am, it represents a massive legal headache. He allowed the accusation to marinate before advancing. Furthermore, the issue extends beyond electoral donations, as your husband's separate commercial pursuits, including marijuana cultivation, vineyard operations, and external advisory deals, have sparked independent controversies involving immense capital that investigative reporters continually fail to track from origin point to final destination. When your legal spouse operates an agency soaking up massive campaign payouts while his alternate corporations feature mysterious ledgers, ma'am, the appropriate terminology hardly describes innovative capitalism, rather the accurate vocabulary highlights a distinct pattern. He bypassed waiting for a rebuttal, flipping a single sheet inside a slim dossier, acting as his solitary visual aid, completely devoid of markings or theatrical dividers, stating, "Additionally, we face the citizenship controversy, a subject I introduced lacking any malicious intent, purely because you initiated the border dialogue during your aggressive tirade against my character." He stared back into her eyes. Substantial, well-researched claims exist, scrutinized by major regional newspapers and audited by various national bureaus, asserting that you legally wed your sibling over a decade ago specifically to execute a severe visa scam. You naturally reject these charges, yet the specific documentation capable of exonerating or convicting you, specifically your historical financial declarations, remain firmly hidden by your own hand, and upon receiving a legal summons from a fellow legislator demanding those exact papers recently, you aggressively fought the request within the judicial system. He shut the paper binder softly, resembling the motion of shutting a completed novel, declaring, "I generated my fortune documenting my personal trauma, while you generated yours funneling political donations directly into your marital estate. I provided total transparency, whereas you desperately corrected your paperwork strictly after facing exposure, marking the fundamental contrast between us." Her lowered arm now rested near her waistline, digits bending slightly onto her tailored blazer, avoiding a clenched strike yet refusing a relaxed splay, occupying an awkward middle ground typical of an individual desiring to make a physical point without understanding exactly what motion to properly execute. For the initial time in nearly a half hour, he reclined against the grand seat, altering his physical carriage in a noticeable manner, appearing less rigid rather than more, metaphorically sheathing his statistical blade to prepare for a delivery rooted in something far more ancient than mere numbers. "Congresswoman, I desire to express an intimate sentiment, assuming you remain willing to listen." His tone lowered noticeably, avoiding a muted breath, but finding the specific pitch an individual employs to address a solitary target surrounded by a massive crowd, adopting the frequency of an intimate dialogue rather than a broadcasted lecture. "I arise each morning filled with profound appreciation, completely avoiding the superficial thankfulness elected officials constantly peddle regarding their honor to govern and similar meaningless platitudes. I mean an absolute authentic appreciation, the variety that strikes you while resting horizontally before dawn, reminiscing about a deceased grandmother, prompting you to vocalize gratitude to a spirit incapable of physically hearing the words." The legislative hall remained absolutely frozen, lacking the expectant quiet of a crowd anticipating a joke, radiating instead the profound silence of humans absorbing pure honesty. "I appreciate the military instructor who aggressively disciplined me over several months of basic training, transforming a terrified Midwestern youth into a fully capable adult. I remain thankful for my spouse discovering hidden potential I personally overlooked, and I deeply appreciate the public educators back home who refuse to abandon my potential, despite my academic performance tanking during each of my mother's disastrous romantic entanglements. D. He locked on to his rival, and his previously calculating, placid expression shifted to reveal a new emotion entirely, projecting pure melancholy instead of fury or victory. I hold endless appreciation for the United States, rejecting abstract patriotic theories in favor of this tangible nation, embracing its genuine imperfections alongside its gorgeous realities, a system that elevated a drug den survivor to the second highest executive office, and my daily repayment for that miracle is pure, unadulterated gratitude. He paused for a prolonged moment. Congresswoman, this exact same nation that rescued you from an African displacement camp, granting you legal status alongside a powerful legislative role, the identical republic that extracted me from a narcotic nightmare to provide military discipline and this elevated seat, that specific nation. He tilted closer to the audio receiver. When did you most recently utter a truly affectionate statement regarding it? The inquiry dropped into the grand room resembling a chime echoing across a vacant cathedral, generating an isolated ringing frequency that lingered heavily, devoid of political qualifiers or conditional praise, avoiding simple patriotic slogans, demanding only a timeline for her last genuinely affectionate public remark directed at the sovereign power that preserved her existence. She remained positioned behind the lectern with slightly parted lips, attempting to launch a syllable that fundamentally refused to materialize, given the query entirely bypassed legislative debates, ignored historical ballots, skipped past campaign finance controversies or visa scams or massive welfare thefts, boiling down to a singular temporal requirement she found impossible to fulfill. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, 4. The Legislative Assembly tracked the silence subconsciously, with everyone present experiencing the passage of time vibrating against their ribs, mirroring the physical sensation of awaiting an expected response that continually fails to arrive, causing each passing moment to elongate, solidify, and gain exponential weight. 5 beats, 6, 7. Her assistant ceased his scribbling entirely, letting the paper pad rest against his knees while his writing instrument froze. 8 beats, 9. The vice president refused to bridge the quiet gap, declined to offer an escape hatch, and avoided changing topics, simply occupying his elevated throne while anticipating a reply with the exact demeanor reserved for utterly crucial inquiries, displaying zero frustration or hostility, projecting the endurance of someone accustomed to delaying gratification for significant milestones, fully aware that pausing hardly equates to surrender. 10 beats, her famously elevated jawline stubbornly resisted lowering, yet it ceased its upward climb, settling into a completely neutral posture lacking both rebellion and surrender, establishing an indescribable physical state unique to an individual confronting an incredibly basic query, only to realize their extensive professional history contained absolutely zero relevant replies. I declare it daily, he whispered gently. I utter my thanks, directing it toward my military mentors, expressing it toward the educators who trusted my potential, communicating it toward my deceased grandmother whom I continually address regardless of her absence, and I announce it directly toward this republic. He scanned the broader room before refocusing on his target. When did you most recently express genuine gratitude, ma'am? Entirely bypassing your financial backers or advocacy groups, directing it purely toward the United States, the sovereign territory that physically rescued the pair of us? He halted momentarily before continuing at a lower volume. Because here is the rhetoric I constantly receive from your microphone. I catch flippant remarks regarding foreign cash controlling our strongest Middle Eastern partnership. I catch implications of divided allegiances, representing a trope so historically repulsive that your fellow partisans officially rebuked it. I catch vague dismissals regarding our country's darkest modern tragedy. I catch you characterizing radical demonstrators praising terrorist massacres as noble scholars battling for justice. And I catch your cross-party expulsion from a crucial diplomatic panel due to overwhelming bipartisan consensus determining you were entirely unfit to champion our national priorities overseas. His volume completely failed to spike, lacking a single decibel increase, which proved to be the destructive element, as the reality was delivered lacking any heat, proving that a lukewarm delivery possessed ample power to severely scorch. That represents your official ledger of appreciation, ma'am, establishing exactly how you repaid the society that preserved your existence. Financial slurs, traitorous accusations, vague dismissals of terrorism, culminating in a hollow 10-second void when prompted to offer a single affectionate remark. Amidst the quiet, he delayed another 3 beats before bobbing his head, demonstrating the subtle acknowledgement of an interrogator who obtained a clear response, specifically one defined by a total lack of vocalization. He rose from his chair deliberately, an unorthodox action for the acting leader who conventionally operates while seated, yet this gathering had surpassed Artasien's normal parameters, and his ascension lacked any domineering intent, operating instead as a definitive conclusion, mirroring how an individual gets up to signal the termination of a highly significant discussion. Congresswoman, we both represent direct offspring of this nation's grand promise, he stated with firm consistency, his heartland calmness evolving into a more profound frequency, transforming from mere silence into a massive gravitational pull, both of us, you escaping a combat theater and myself surviving a narcotic den, a pair of youths statistically destined for failure who nonetheless achieved the impossible. He locked eyes with her. The distinguishing factor hardly involves our opposing partisan affiliations, a reality I currently consider irrelevant. The actual divergence lies here. I recognize the promise remains authentic because I personally experienced it, acknowledging its flaws and its failure to rescue absolutely everyone, fully aware that local youths currently endure my exact childhood horrors and several will tragically succumb, yet the promise fundamentally exists. It transformed my reality and my physical presence serves as undeniable verification. His facial muscles clamped once more, locking his jawline firmly, purposely permitting the broadcasting lenses to capture the tension since his subsequent statement transcended simple electoral strategy. You dedicated your professional life to denying this promise exists, primarily because acknowledging its reality, admitting that our society successfully transforms a displaced African migrant into a powerful federal legislator, completely shatters your entire victimization storyline. If this republic genuinely possesses the virtue required for such miracles, then the perpetual rage, the flippant dismissals of tragedy, the hateful financial tropes, the entire strategy completely collapses, since maintaining a victim complex against your ultimate savior remains logically impossible, leaving mere ingratitude as the only accurate description. Her vision darted, avoiding the floor to briefly target the departure doors, executing a rapid ocular flick noticeable solely to the junior staffers positioned perfectly between her lectern and the corridor, marking the absolute first moment during the conflict where her physical form indicated a desired destination, revealing an urge to completely escape. She refrained from stepping away, yet she certainly peaked. I remain thankful, ma'am, while you remain furious, his tone hitting its absolutely quietest frequency of the afternoon, lacking arrogance or pathetic sympathy, projecting the gentle realization of a person identifying a familiar trait previously witnessed in his own parent, specifically a rage born from deeply unhealed trauma that stubbornly festered instead of dissipating, ultimately calcifying into a permanent partisan weapon. And the greatest tragedy remains that one identical homeland miraculously rescued us both. He lowered himself into his chair near the wooden mallet, a tool ignored throughout the confrontation since nobody desired to disrupt the flow, leaving it resting upon the main desk resembling a discarded theatrical accessory from a radically unscripted performance. The legislative gathering officially remained in progress, with the border policy debate technically surviving on the schedule, yet every soul within those walls understood that any subsequent activity, whether a legislative tweak or a formal tally or a parliamentary maneuver, would serve as a completely irrelevant epilogue. The actual event had concluded, effectively terminated by the executive the moment he delivered the most brutally honest statement available before simply returning to his seat. The expansive hall withheld clapping as the upper chamber strictly forbids such outbursts, viewing it as a violation of etiquette, historical precedent, and the dignified atmosphere the wooden architecture and stone walkways were explicitly constructed to mandate. Nevertheless, an occurrence far more deafening than cheers transpired as legislators repositioned themselves across their benches, avoiding awkward shuffling in favor of a resolute movement, executing the bodily adjustment of individuals finalizing a previously uncertain verdict, representing the physical reaction of a crowd watching an executive counter a vicious smear, not with an equal slur, but with an inquiry serving as the most devastating strike delivered within that arena throughout the entire calendar. She lingered behind the microphone for roughly 4 additional beats, clutching her prepared documents, having initiated her gathering process throughout his concluding remarks, resembling a pupil stacking textbooks right before the dismissal tone, letting her upper form emotionally depart well before her legs engaged. She aligned her notes against the wooden border, executing 2 sharp, methodical knocks, displaying the exacting care of an individual desperately requiring a mundane physical task to ground herself, while her internal reality processed a completely novel experience, suffering a massive public defeat while remaining entirely mute. She strolled toward the public exit, maintaining perfect spinal alignment, an undisturbed hijab, and the identical facial elevation she displayed upon entry, yet her stride carried an altered rhythm, lacking the cadence of an official arriving to broadcast a strict directive, projecting instead the gait of an official who arrived with a directive only to receive a devastating query, an inquiry that continued vibrating across the space she abandoned, pursuing her past the heavy doors, trailing her down the marble corridors and shadowing her inside the vehicle, transporting her toward the lower Congressional wing, ensuring she would eventually occupy her personal suite only to face over a dozen journalists consecutively repeating the exact same temporal query regarding her gratitude, a question she would predictably continue to ignore. A snippet struck social media prior to her even reaching the exterior hallway, avoiding the comprehensive footage since online audiences reject 20-minute videos, isolating instead a compact 63-second fragment launching precisely at his demand for her most recent affectionate remark, and concluding immediately upon his reference to the Republic that preserved their mutual existences. A minute-long package featuring a 10-second quiet void directly in its center, and that specific empty span fractured the digital sphere completely, propelling her specific muteness to the top trending spot under 2 hours, amassing tens of millions of clicks shortly thereafter, proving the footage required zero external analysis since the utter silence functioned as the ultimate analytical breakdown. A horrific 10-count featuring a federal representative lingering near a lectern with a gaping jaw, totally paralyzed and failing to cite one isolated instance of directing positive sentiments toward the sovereign state that legally naturalized her. A major conservative network broadcast the comprehensive interaction without edits throughout their primetime slot, an incredibly rare decision since raw tape inherently lacks the flashy banners, lower third text, and loud multi-guest debates designed to retain an audience's attention. Yet the executives realized this specific material bypassed the need for visual enhancement because the raw reality served as its own spectacular visual. The rival network's analysis proved equally illuminating when their star anchor aired the exact timeline snippet before addressing his studio guests, prompting a liberal strategist to initially defend the politician by claiming she frequently communicated her appreciation, before suddenly halting, frantically scanning her briefing materials, muttering incomplete defenses, and ultimately abandoning the defense entirely as she desperately hunted for a tangible citation, an unconditional and absolute phrase praising the nation, only to realize such a statement simply did not exist. The dual survivor narrative instantly hijacked the media cycle, discarding the personal rivalry or the standard partisan warfare in favor of highlighting a pair of citizens rescued by an identical homeland where one loudly verbalized his appreciation. The other completely failed to pinpoint a recent instance of similar gratitude, creating a destructive contrast immune to traditional ideological dismissals. Critics failed to label the critique bigoted since he deeply validated her traumatic origins, They failed to scream misogyny given his total avoidance of gendered rhetoric. They failed to cry religious prejudice since faith remained entirely undiscussed, leaving pure reality as the only viable description, a reality that hovered unanswered in the federal room for a prolonged span, forcing her staff to eventually issue a delayed defensive memo condemning his actions as a hazardous diversionary tactic threatening minority groups, leaning heavily on buzzwords like hazard and diversion, while notably omitting the nation's name completely. Digital commentators swiftly caught the omission, noting she possessed an extended window to simply issue a polite national compliment. A highly circulated post highlighted that she utilized that entire duration to weaponize accusatory vocabulary instead. His initial thesis found complete validation when a major advocacy group branded the confrontation a coded racial attack masquerading as an intimate anecdote, sparking a massive secondary wave of online videos featuring his passionate military tribute juxtaposed against the organization's ridiculous statement, daring viewers to identify the actual coded hostility, while simultaneously the electoral finance grievances secured renewed vigor as multiple lawmakers officially demanded an extensive audit, prompting her husband's corporation to temporarily halt their political collaboration, exactly as the congressional demand for her historical IRS filings advanced toward a summer courtroom battle, though her most devastating wounds were fundamentally reputational rather than strictly judicial. The concept of a dual migrant reality morphed into a cultural catchphrase, decorating vehicular decals, anchoring editorial columns, and inspiring weekend religious addresses, operating as a condensed symbol asserting that the Republic's value stems from the openly grateful individuals it actively rescues, rather than the cynical voices constantly criticizing it, perfectly encapsulated by an Oklahoma clergyman and former African asylum seeker who anchored his weekend homily on this exact theme, openly asking his flock to personally identify which category they occupied. That specific spiritual lesson, captured via a mobile device and uploaded online, garnered millions of rapid views, allowing an obscure heartland preacher addressing a tiny basement gathering to organically outpace the Congresswoman's entire aggressive media strategy, while simultaneously, a veteran Middle Eastern educator operating in the Midwest assigned the unedited confrontation as mandatory homework, instructing her pupils to objectively analyze both figures before answering the identical core question regarding their own most recent expression of national appreciation. While over half her class successfully provided an example, the remaining fraction lingered in silent contemplation, an occurrence the instructor later described to regional journalists as the most developmentally beneficial quiet span of her lengthy career, transforming the temporal inquiry into a widespread digital phenomenon, yet avoiding sarcastic humor in favor of absolute sincerity, prompting average citizens to upload deeply personal replies, ranging from border town freight operators and urban cosmetologists to aging veterans and Midwestern medical professionals of East African descent, with one specific healthcare worker looking into her lens to declare her gratitude for the functional medical infrastructure that recently preserved her patient's life. That individual video effortlessly breached 10 million impressions, simultaneously reaching a local resident resting near his Ohio porch mere streets away from the executive's childhood home and within walking distance of the enlistment center he entered as a minor. The morning after the terrorist strikes, lacking parental consent but refusing to delay, a man now navigating his 40s while earning hourly wages at a distribution hub, utilizing functional arms to move cargo despite suffering severe joint degradation from desert combat deployments, viewing the viral confrontation via a handheld screen without seeking a comfortable seat, reflecting his utilitarian nature of quickly digesting information before returning strictly to his physical labor. The politician noted the quartet of high school peers flocking toward the Central Avenue military station. He temporarily halted the broadcast to scan his immediate surroundings, absorbing the cracked pavement and abandoned corner properties alongside a lone cycling child, recognizing the identical municipal spirit persisting across a brand new era before resuming the video. The screen declared that a solitary volunteer lost critical pieces of himself overseas. He stared downward toward his lower legs, specifically the scarred limb damaged by explosive fragments in Iraq, the appendage capable of forecasting incoming storms with greater accuracy than meteorological software, the injury transforming basic workplace stairwells into agonizing challenges, feeling a familiar throb that always flared whenever combat zones entered the conversation, manifesting a physical echo rather than a psychological illusion, prompting him to whisper his absolute agreement into the empty air, directing his validation toward the empty asphalt or the passing cyclist or the ghosts of his fellow high school recruits, acknowledging that they enlisted specifically to counter the horrific tragedy she carelessly dismissed as a minor occurrence, leading him to pocket his device and slowly rise to accommodate his stiff joints, shuffling indoors past utility invoices and stale snacks to briefly acknowledge a framed portrait capturing his youthful self in formal military attire, beaming with the innocent pride of an 18-year-old completely ignorant of future warfare yet wholly committed to defending his nation after thousands perished, perfectly exemplifying the regional instinct to aggressively answer the call when a world-altering catastrophe struck, tapping the glass casing briefly before resuming his daily grind, while miles away a shopkeeper scrubbed the checkout surface inside his Midwestern urban market, positioned along a vibrant multicultural corridor famously dubbed a miniature version of the Somali capital, featuring bilingual storefronts and eclectic inventories mixing classic American canned goods alongside traditional imported beverages. At 6:15, the evening customer wave began receding while a compact monitor installed behind the till over a decade prior broadcasted the viral political confrontation, explicitly streamed there by a younger relative who firmly adhered to the modern philosophy that vital cultural moments exclusively exist digitally and naturally require the largest available display format. The politician's question echoed throughout the cramped market, asking for a timeline regarding genuine national appreciation, causing the shopkeeper to pause his cleaning and stare at the broadcast, reflecting on his 2 decades residing within the Republic since escaping an African metropolis, enduring grueling shifts inside regional slaughterhouses to accumulate modest savings, ultimately acquiring the commercial space through federal business funding and massive personal anxiety, a lengthy era where he successfully eliminated his debt, funded higher education for his offspring, mourned a patriarch who barely survived the initial migration, and successfully weathered armed theft alongside a global pandemic and local corruption scandals that technically spared his cash register yet severely tarnished his community's standing. He shifted his gaze from the monitor toward the custom placard suspended above his entrance, a fixture commissioned during the business's infancy when the surrounding streets proved exceptionally dangerous and he desperately desired to establish a safe haven for all patrons, featuring bilingual lettering that communicated a singular inviting concept, a warm greeting. Continuously, he murmured so faintly that his younger employee organizing inventory mere steps away remained completely oblivious. I express my gratitude on a continuous basis. He observed the silent representative frozen on screen and whispered a recommendation for her to attempt a similar mindset, prompting a confused reaction from his nephew, which he quickly dismissed, returning to his circular scrubbing routine, a repetitive action perfected over a decade representing an owner protecting his personal investment based on the fundamental principle that individuals inherently maintain what they possess and naturally bless whatever sustains them, while just beyond the glass, the vibrant neighborhood transitioned into twilight as specialized meat vendors locked their doors, cafes grew crowded, diverse families navigated the sidewalks, and sports fans bonded with their children, all collectively functioning as a unique variation of the national fabric, mirroring the exact same patriotic essence found within gritty heartland manufacturing hubs or any other municipality across the map that welcomes outsiders and provides them an opportunity to construct a stable existence. He glanced upward at his welcoming placard a final time, recognizing it as his permanent daily tribute, standing in stark contrast to a legislator who lobbed insults of hypocrisy only to receive a story about a fierce grandmother who labeled her opponent a political tool only to hear a testament regarding the aftermath of a terror strike, and who aggressively criticized the metaphorical ladder of success only to face a devastating inquiry regarding her personal gratitude, a moment that absolutely justifies blessing the brave Heartland youths who stormed military centers following a national tragedy because they refused to minimize the horror, and similarly justifies blessing the humble immigrant shopkeeper whose simple bilingual greeting and dedicated work ethic provided a superior lesson in national appreciation than countless rehearsed political monologues, ultimately highlighting a tale of two rescued citizens within a shared republic where one expressed profound thanks while the other completely failed, delivering endless defensive statements surrounding a brutal 10-second void and an incredibly simple question she continually refuses to address. Exactly when did she last manage to speak warmly of the United States?